This week we're going to talk about Chapter 8, which is the interface, the game interface, creating the connection, and that connection is between the player and the game. We're going to talk about how you should have player-centered design, what the components of a game interface are, what's the difference between a physical and visual interface, and then what's the difference between a passive and active visual interface, and we're going to talk about usability and accessibility. So interface design is the connection between the player and the game. You should always have player-centered design, which means your design for your interface, you need to really think about your player. Who is the audience? Is the audience adults who can use controllers? And are they children? Are they people who have disabilities? You need to think about all of that. Focus on the player's needs, tasks, and choices. And then the interface needs to take into account actions that the player will be having to do in the game and information that the player will need while playing the game. When we talk about gameplay, we're talking about the connection between the player and the interface. And that's what truly allows the game to be interactive. Gameplay is the core of the gaming experience and it involves all the actions the player takes during the game. Story is another important part of the interface. The interface needs to reflect the game's story, either visually or manually. It needs to take into account the setting, the mood, the time period, the environment, and give a way for the player to be completely immersed in the gaming experience. Character design is another important aspect of many games. You need to be able to control the characters through the interface. The players need to be able to access weapons, clothing, powers, vehicles, personality traits, all the different character traits you might want to have for your characters. Sometimes you want those to be changeable, or you want the player to be able to pick their own characteristics for their players. Audio is another part of the interface. Audio works with the visual or manual interface to bring a feeling of reality to the game. We're going to actually have a whole chapter on audio. Audio includes music, sound effects, and spoken dialogue and narration. You can provide a lot of information with audio, and that needs to be a really important part of your interface. Sometimes the player interface is modified depending on what part of the world, the game world, the player is in. And one of the most common ways to deal with that is to design a level structure by using maps that can be accessed through the game interface. So there are actually two types of interfaces. There's the manual or physical interface, and there's the visual interface. So we're going to address both of those. So here's some examples of some physical interfaces. You can have a dance pad that you step on. You can have controllers that the user uses in different ways. So like in arcade games, you might have special controllers. You can do interesting things with arcades. You can have a car with a steering wheel and a gas pedal. You can have the player sit on a motorcycle. You can have guns. You can have just buttons. So there's all sorts of things that you can do with the manual interface for an arcade game. Computer games, basically the interface is a keyboard and mouse. And so you have to just give consideration into all the different keys that you can use and the mouse clicks, and you don't want to make it too complicated. You need to think about which keys you're going to have the player use for their interface. Console games have different types of controllers, but notice that most of the controllers look very similar. They all have D-pads and buttons, and usually in the same place. The Wiimote was one that was a little different, but the controller has to be easily understandable, not too many things on the controller, and you have to just figure out a way that the player uses the controller to interact with the game. Here's some other interesting console interfaces that have been developed over time. I'm sure you can think of other ones too that you've seen. Handheld games, they often have a touch screen that the controls look a lot like a controller on a console. And then there's mobile, and mobile is all touch screen. They do have some controllers for mobile, but basically you use the touch screen to interface with the game. So visual interfaces, that's what you see. The other ones were physical. We talked about physical or manual interfaces. That's how you physically use something to interact with the game. Visual interface is how you interact with the game by what you see on the screen. So there's two types of visual interfaces. There's an active visual interface and there's a passive visual interface. An active visual interface is something like menus and buttons, and we're going to show some other examples in a minute. A passive visual interface is something that you really can't interact with, you just see it. So like the heads-up display, which shows usually health, lives, score, things like that. So you have no control over what is displayed, the player. The player can't change the display like they can in an active visual interface. So then for each platform, there are specific features that you might need to have for your interface. An arcade game, you will want to have you won't want a very involved visual interface. You want it to be just passive. You don't want to have a whole lot of menus for players to go through. You just want them to get information. Whereas a computer and a console, you can have a lot of information that the player can then interact with through menus and making selections. Score. So these are passive visual interface components. So you might have the score, you might have lives and power. These are all passive. They change depending on what you do in the game. However, the player has no interaction with this part of the visual interface. You just see it. You don't change it. Map. You can see the map. But now an active visual interface is something that the player sees on the screen and can actually interact with. So things like menus, character creation screens, choosing weapons. Here's a whole start screen that is also an active visual interface where you might have new game, load game, save game, credits, things like that. We might have genre-specific interfaces. So depending on the type of genre, your interface is going to be different. So for action games are very fast and they need a lot of hand-eye coordination and reflexes and quick decision making. So you don't want the player to have to see a lot on the screen. You pretty much want them to have a heads-up display, not a lot of menus or anything. As opposed to an adventure game where the player can have a lot of choices that they can make on the screen. They can have menus, they can have inventory, they can take a lot of time to look through a lot more information. Role-playing games, you'll have character generation screens, navigation controls, inventory. Simulation games will also be a lot of heads-up display where the player is getting information but not necessarily actively able to change that information. Sports games, You need to think about, for each of the different genres, what type of visual interface and manual interface you'll want to have for those games. Strategy games, you can take a lot more time in a strategy game, and the player can interact a lot more with what they see on the screen. You want your games to be usable. And what we mean by usable is how easily can we pick up and play the game. You need your interface to be functional. You want the player to be able to play the game, and you need to take in consideration accessibility, meaning some people will have disabilities. How can you create ways for them to play your games as well? So here's what defines a dysfunctional interface. This is what you do not want in your interface. You don't want it to be cryptic, okay? You want your controls to be intuitive. If they aren't intuitive, then it's a cryptic interface and it's hard for players to figure out what to do. You don't want your game interface to be complex. If you give the player too many options, then they can't really play the game very easily. But at the same time, you don't want it to be too simplistic, where the players don't have very many choices to make. So you have to have a good balance. You want the game to be consistent, because if it's inconsistent and it's confusing, then the players can't play. You also don't want the interface to be inefficient, which means like you have to interact with buttons too often or keys too often, or there's too much that you have to do in order to interact with the game. And you don't want the interface to be cluttered. It shouldn't be crowded. It shouldn't be difficult to use. So in other words, you want the game to be intuitive, somewhere between complex and simplistic, consistent, efficient, and not cluttered. So when we talk about usability, we also talk about accessibility, and that means how accessible is the game to people who might have disabilities. And there's 5 disabilities we're going to talk about. The first one is a visual disability. So visually impaired players include those who are colorblind or partially blind or completely blind. So how could you help a visually impaired player to be able to play a video game? Well, if they're colorblind, a lot of games will have colorblind modes where usually people are colorblind where they can't differentiate between green and red. That's a very common color blindness. So you can make it so that the player has the option to change the colors on the screen and have, instead of green and red, they can have purple and yellow. If a player is completely blind, well then maybe you have your controls have rumble, or you give them more audio clues. Audio disability is if a player has trouble hearing. So they might be deaf, partially or completely deaf. And what you can do for those people is maybe have subtitles on your screen, especially in cutscenes or whenever there's dialogue. You can also put subtitles up for sounds that are on the screen. So maybe a bell is ringing and you'd have the subtitle that says bell ringing. The next disability is motor. Some people have trouble actually moving their hands. Maybe they can't use a keyboard or a controller very easily. So maybe you have some other type of input device that they can use in order to navigate your game. Speech is another disability. There are some games that you actually have to use speech in the game. And so maybe what you do is you give the player an option to type responses or their commands into the game. Also, maybe if you have voice chat, maybe also have a way that you have a chat that people can type into. And then there's cognitive disability. That's where people might have trouble reading or writing or envisioning spatial relationships. So you can address this disability by simplifying menus, maybe have different levels in your game and making it easier to understand. Finally, we're going to talk about save game options. There are several different ways that when you're creating a game, you can have it for the game to be saved. And they all have different levels of taking the player out of the immersion in the game. Saving the game can affect how immersed you are. So if you have to actually, if the player has to stop and think about, oh, I need to save the game, that completely takes you out of the immersion of the game. So there are different options, and you're actually going to have a question in your homework that talks about that and asks you which you think is the best option. But the first one is quick save, where the player can just quickly save the game at any point. This doesn't really affect the player's immersion, but the disadvantage to this is that you usually only have a single save slot, and you might be in the middle of a fight and you do have to think about saving the game. So it does mean the player has to think about it a little bit, and it allows the player to, you can save the game and then you can die and then you can go right back to where you were right before the fight and save the game again until you get past it. So there's pros and cons to this, to the quick save. Autosave is where the game automatically saves for you. So you're playing the game, you don't have to think about it. Your immersion is never affected, but it's not happening all the time. The game, will save every once in a while. If you do die, you're going to go back to the last place that was saved, but that might be quite a bit back from when you died. So when you're creating your game, you have to decide if you're going to do autosave, how often you're going to do it. And then there's save to slot or file. This is where literally the player can choose to save. They can save many different versions of their game. It does take you out of immersion, but it allows you to, like I said, save different versions as opposed to the quick save, which you only have one version saved, and the autosave, usually there's just one. But this type of save is very harmful to the immersiveness in the game. So there's a whole debate on saving games among developers concerning whether or not the player should be allowed the freedom to save a game at any point, or if part of the challenge is that they don't have that freedom. The game is saved sometimes, or maybe it's saved just when you decide to exit. There are some games that have rewards for not saving the game in the middle of it. So you need to think about how you want to deal with the save game options when you're creating a game. That's pretty much interface design. Remember that your design needs to be player-centered. We talked about different game features for different interfaces. We talked about the different interface types. We talked about usability and accessibility and how the interface affects the player experience. So have a great week, and I'm always here. If you have questions, you can email me, and I'll talk to you next week.